Have you ever fallen deeply in love with someone, only to discover later that the person you thought you knew never really existed? That the qualities you adored, the traits that made your heart skip, were nothing more than reflections of your own unconscious desires projected onto another human being. Carl Jung, the pioneering Swiss psychiatrist who mapped the hidden territories of the human psyche, warned us about this psychological phenomenon over a century ago. He called it projection, and he believed it was one of the most dangerous forms of self-deception we could engage in. Jung observed that when we fall in love with our own projections, we're not truly loving another person at all. We're loving an illusion, a ghost created by our own unconscious mind. In the next 27 minutes, I'm going to reveal 7 unmistakable signs that you're in love with your own projection rather than with a real human being. These signs will expose the hidden patterns that keep you trapped in cycles of romantic disappointment, help you understand why your relationships feel like they're built on quicksand, and show you how your unconscious mind creates elaborate fantasies that feel more real than reality itself. By the end of this exploration, you'll possess the psychological tools to distinguish between authentic love and projected fantasy, potentially saving yourself years of heartbreak and confusion. The first sign that you're in love with your own projection is perhaps the most seductive and dangerous of all. You find yourself constantly thinking about this person's potential rather than their present reality. Jung understood that the human psyche has a remarkable capacity to see what it wants to see, especially when the heart is involved. When you're projecting, you're not falling in love with who someone is today, in this moment, with all their flaws and limitations and human messiness. Instead, you're falling in love with who they could become, with the version of them that exists only in your imagination. Imagine Sarah, a brilliant architect who meets David at a coffee shop. David is charming in conversation, but frequently late, often cancels plans, and shows little interest in her work. Instead of seeing these as fundamental character traits, Sarah finds herself thinking, once he realizes how amazing I am, he'll want to prioritize our relationship. Once he understands my passion for architecture, he'll become more supportive. Once we're closer, he'll become more reliable. Sarah has created a fantasy version of David that bears little resemblance to the actual man sitting across from her. She's fallen in love with her own projection of his potential. Jung called this phenomenon the anima or animus projection. The anima represents the feminine aspect within every man's unconscious, while the animus represents the masculine aspect within every woman's unconscious. When we project these archetypal images onto others, we're essentially asking them to carry the undeveloped parts of our own psyche. Sarah isn't just seeing potential in David. She's projecting her own animus, her own idealized version of masculine strength and reliability onto a man who has never demonstrated these qualities. The psychological consequence of this projection is profound. You become addicted to potential rather than reality. You stay in relationships that drain your energy because you're always waiting for the person to transform into your projection. You ignore red flags because they don't fit your fantasy. Most tragically, you never actually get to know the real person standing in front of you, which means you never experience authentic intimacy. The second sign reveals itself through an almost obsessive focus on small gestures and fleeting moments that seem to confirm your fantasy. When you're in love with your projection, you become like a detective searching for evidence to support your case, magnifying tiny interactions into proof of deeper connection. A casual text message becomes a love letter. A moment of eye contact becomes a soul recognition. A simple compliment becomes validation of your entire relationship fantasy. Consider Marcus, who's been dating Elena for 3 months. Elena is generally distant, rarely initiates contact, and has explicitly told him she's not looking for anything serious. But Marcus remembers the one evening when she laughed at his joke for 30 seconds longer than usual. He replays the moment she briefly touched his arm while walking past. He analyzes a text message where she used a heart emoji, convincing himself it means more than casual friendliness. Marcus has created an entire narrative of deep connection based on these microscopic moments, while ignoring the overwhelming evidence that Elena views their relationship very differently. Jung would recognize this as the unconscious mind's attempt to maintain its projection at all costs. The psyche becomes invested in its own creation and will selectively gather evidence to support its fantasy while dismissing contradictory information. This is why people often say they saw signs that weren't really there, why they believed someone cared more than they actually did. The unconscious mind is remarkably creative when it comes to maintaining its illusions. The spiritual consequence here is that you lose touch with your intuitive knowing. Your gut instincts, which Jung believed were connected to deeper wisdom, become clouded by wishful thinking. You stop trusting your authentic perceptions because they conflict with your desired reality. This disconnection from your inner knowing can have ripple effects throughout your life, making you question your judgment in other important areas. The third sign manifests as an unusual tolerance for behavior that would normally concern you. When you're projecting onto someone, you develop an almost supernatural ability to explain away their actions that don't align with your fantasy. This isn't conscious denial, it's an unconscious protective mechanism that preserves your projection by reframing problematic behavior as either temporary aberrations or misunderstood expressions of deeper qualities. Picture Rebecca, a successful therapist who prides herself on her ability to read people. She begins dating James, a man who frequently makes dismissive comments about her work, rarely asks about her day, and seems more interested in talking about himself than learning about her. In any other context, Rebecca would immediately recognize these as signs of narcissistic behavior. But because she's projecting her animus onto James, she reframes his self-centeredness as confidence, his dismissiveness as intellectual honesty, and his lack of curiosity about her life as giving her space to be independent. Jung observed that projection acts like a psychological filter, distorting our perception of reality to protect our unconscious fantasies. When we project our anima or animus onto someone, we unconsciously need them to be the person we believe them to be. This need becomes so strong that we'll perform remarkable mental gymnastics to maintain the illusion. We become apologists for behavior we would never tolerate from friends or family members. The deeper psychological truth here is that you're not just tolerating their behavior, you're tolerating it because you've unconsciously assigned them a sacred role in your psyche. They're carrying your projection of wholeness, completion, or healing. To acknowledge their flaws would be to face the painful reality that wholeness cannot come from another person, but must be developed within yourself. Jung called this process individuation, the lifelong journey of becoming who you truly are, rather than who you think you need another person to make you. As we move deeper into this psychological territory, I want to pause and acknowledge something important. If you're recognizing yourself in these patterns, please don't judge yourself harshly. Projection is not a character flaw, it's a universal human tendency that serves important psychological functions. Jung himself emphasized that projection is how we first encounter the undeveloped parts of our own psyche. The goal isn't to never project, but to become conscious of our projections so we can reclaim the energy and integrate the qualities we've been seeking in others. This awareness is the beginning of genuine self-love and ultimately the capacity for authentic love. The fourth sign emerges through your relationship to time and future planning. When you're in love with your projection, you find yourself constantly living in an imagined future where your fantasy version of this person finally emerges fully formed. You make plans based not on who they are today, but on who you believe they're becoming. You postpone important life decisions because you're waiting for them to evolve into someone who can truly partner with you in those decisions. Consider the story of William, a successful entrepreneur who meets Catherine at a business conference. Catherine mentions that she's thinking about starting her own company someday and seems interested in entrepreneurship. Despite the fact that she's never taken concrete steps toward this goal and shows little understanding of what building a business actually requires, William begins including her in his long-term business plans. He imagines them as a power couple, building empires together. He postpones expanding to new markets because he wants to wait until she's ready to join him. He turns down partnerships because he's saving space for the company he believes she'll eventually create. Jung would understand William's behavior as a classic example of anima projection, combined with what he called participation mystique, a psychological state where we lose the boundaries between ourselves and another person. William isn't just seeing potential in Catherine. He's projecting his own entrepreneurial drive onto her and then falling in love with this reflection of himself. He's created a shared identity that exists only in his imagination. The spiritual consequence of this temporal projection is that you sacrifice your present reality for an imagined future. You make decisions based on fantasy rather than facts, which can lead to years of stagnation and missed opportunities. More deeply, you avoid the spiritual work of accepting what is, rather than insisting on what should be. Jung believed that acceptance of reality was prerequisite to psychological growth and spiritual development. The fifth sign reveals itself through the quality of your conversations and emotional exchanges. When you're projecting onto someone, your interactions often feel curiously one-sided, though you may not consciously recognize this imbalance. You find yourself doing most of the emotional heavy lifting in the relationship, sharing your deeper thoughts and feelings while receiving relatively superficial responses in return. Yet somehow, these limited exchanges feel profoundly meaningful to you. This happens because you're not just hearing their actual words. You're unconsciously filling in the gaps with the responses you wish they would give. When they offer a brief, generic comment about your day, you hear deep empathy and understanding. When they share a surface-level thought, you perceive profound wisdom and insight. You're essentially having two conversations, the actual one happening in reality and the imagined one occurring in your projection. Take the example of Lisa, a poet who begins dating Robert, a pragmatic accountant. Lisa shares her deepest creative struggles, her philosophical questions about art and meaning, her vulnerabilities around being an artist in a materialistic world. Robert typically responds with practical suggestions or changes the subject to more concrete topics like weekend plans or work logistics. But Lisa finds herself feeling deeply understood after these conversations. She tells friends that Robert gets her artistic soul, that he provides grounding for her creative flights. She's unconsciously translating his practical responses into the emotional support she's craving. Jung would recognize this as the anima projection in full effect. Lisa has projected her idealized version of masculine support and understanding onto Robert, who has never actually provided these qualities. She's in love with her own internal animus, the wise and supportive masculine energy within her own psyche, which she's placed onto Robert's psychological shoulders. The psychological consequence here goes beyond mere disappointment. When you consistently project profound meaning onto superficial exchanges, you lose touch with your actual needs for emotional intimacy and understanding. You begin to accept crumbs of connection while believing you're receiving a feast. This pattern can persist for years, leaving you feeling mysteriously unfulfilled, despite believing you're in a deeply connected relationship. The sixth sign manifests through your relationship to conflict and disagreement. When you're projecting onto someone, you develop an unusual aversion to any form of confrontation or honest disagreement with them. This isn't because you naturally avoid conflict. You might be quite direct and assertive in other relationships. Instead, it's because disagreement threatens your projection by revealing the gap between your fantasy and their reality. Jung observed that projection requires a certain psychological distance to maintain itself. The closer we get to really knowing someone, the more difficult it becomes to maintain our fantasies about them. Conflict forces intimacy by revealing how someone actually thinks, what they actually value, and how they actually behave under pressure. When you're in love with your projection, these revelations feel dangerous rather than illuminating. Consider David, a passionate environmentalist who begins dating Maria. David has projected his own environmental consciousness onto Maria based on a few casual comments she made about recycling and buying organic food. When Maria suggests they take a vacation that involves extensive air travel to multiple destinations, David feels a strange reluctance to express his concerns about the environmental impact. When she mentions that she's considering buying a large SUV, he finds himself making excuses for her choice rather than engaging in the kind of environmental discussion he would have with anyone else. David's avoidance of these conversations isn't just about keeping the peace. It's about preserving his projection of Maria as an environmentally conscious person. To truly discuss their different values would be to discover that his fantasy version of Maria doesn't align with the real woman, and his unconscious mind will do almost anything to avoid this painful recognition. The spiritual consequence of avoiding authentic disagreement is that you never truly meet the other person, and they never truly meet you. Jung believed that genuine intimacy required what he called the clash of opposites, the willingness to encounter difference and work through it together. When you avoid this clash to preserve your projections, you remain forever strangers, no matter how much time you spend together. Before we explore the seventh and most revealing sign, it's worth taking a moment to understand why projection feels so compelling and necessary. Jung discovered that projection isn't just a romantic phenomenon. It's how the unconscious mind shows us the parts of ourselves that we haven't yet integrated. When you project your anima or animus onto someone, you're unconsciously recognizing qualities within yourself that you haven't yet acknowledged or developed. The person who projects confidence onto others often needs to develop their own self-assurance. The person who projects artistic sensitivity onto partners may need to explore their own creative nature. The person who projects spiritual wisdom onto others is being called to deepen their own spiritual practice. Projection, in this sense, is the psyche's way of showing us our own unlived potential. This understanding transforms projection from a problem to be solved into a doorway to be walked through. The goal isn't to stop projecting entirely, which would be impossible for any conscious human being. The goal is to become aware of our projections so we can reclaim the energy we've invested in others and begin developing these qualities within ourselves. Jung called this process withdrawing projections, and he considered it one of the most important tasks of psychological development. The seventh and most profound sign that you're in love with your own projection emerges through your relationship to the other person's autonomy and separate existence. When you're projecting, you unconsciously relate to them as if they exist primarily in relationship to you, rather than as a complete autonomous human being with their own complex inner life, relationships, goals, and struggles that have nothing to do with you. This sign is subtle but unmistakable once you know what to look for. You find yourself feeling surprised or even slightly offended when they make decisions without consulting you, pursue interests you don't share, or have strong emotional reactions to situations that don't involve you. You may catch yourself thinking things like, "Why didn't they tell me about that?" Or, "I don't understand why they care so much about that." Or, "They seem different when they're with their friends." These thoughts reveal that you've been unconsciously expecting them to exist primarily within the context of your relationship and your projections. Jung understood this as one of the deepest aspects of projection. When we project onto someone, we unconsciously make them a character in our own psychological drama, rather than recognizing them as the protagonist of their own life story. We expect them to behave in ways that support our projections and feel confused or betrayed when they act according to their own nature and needs. Imagine Sarah, who has been dating Michael for 8 months. Sarah has projected her animus onto Michael, seeing him as her ideal partner and future husband. She's noticed that Michael seems more relaxed and humorous when he's with his childhood friends, laughing at jokes she doesn't find funny and reminiscing about experiences she doesn't share. Instead of appreciating this glimpse into Michael's complete personality, Sarah feels vaguely threatened. She finds herself making subtle criticisms of his friends or feeling hurt that he has a part of himself that exists independently of their relationship. What Sarah is experiencing is the collision between her projection and Michael's authentic selfhood. Her unconscious mind has cast Michael in the role of her romantic completion, and any evidence of his separate existence challenges this fantasy. She's not relating to Michael as a whole person, she's relating to him as the carrier of her own psychological projections. The psychological consequence of this pattern extends far beyond romantic disappointment. When you consistently relate to others as extensions of your own psyche, rather than as autonomous beings, you never develop the capacity for genuine intimacy. Jung believed that real love required what he called the recognition of otherness, the ability to see and appreciate another person as fundamentally separate from yourself while still choosing to connect with them. Moreover, this pattern prevents you from developing a healthy relationship with your own autonomy. If you need others to be extensions of yourself, it's often because you haven't yet learned to be comfortable with your own separate existence. You haven't developed what Jung called a strong ego, the psychological structure that allows you to maintain your sense of self while genuinely encountering others. The spiritual dimension of this sign points toward one of the most important paradoxes of human relationship. We must become whole within ourselves before we can truly meet another person. Jung observed that people often seek in relationships what they haven't yet developed within themselves, but that this seeking actually prevents the very intimacy they're craving. When you can meet someone as a complete autonomous being while maintaining your own completeness and autonomy, you create the possibility for what Jung called conscious relationship, partnership between two whole people rather than two halves seeking completion. This brings us to the heart of Jung's most important insight about projection and romantic love. The qualities you project onto others, the aspects of human experience you find most attractive and compelling in potential partners, are almost always reflections of undeveloped potentials within your own psyche. The sensitive artist you're drawn to reflects your own undeveloped creativity. The confident leader who attracts you embodies your own unrecognized power. The spiritual teacher you idealize carries your own unacknowledged wisdom. Jung believed that romantic attraction often functions as a map to our own individuation process. The people who trigger the strongest projections in us are showing us the qualities we most need to develop within ourselves. This doesn't mean that attraction is meaningless or that we should never fall in love. Instead, it means that conscious people can use their attractions as guides to their own psychological development. When you begin dating someone who embodies qualities you admire, instead of simply basking in their reflected light, you can ask yourself, how can I develop these qualities within myself? What would it look like for me to embody this confidence, this creativity, this wisdom in my own unique way? This shift from projection to self-development transforms romantic relationships from desperate attempts to complete yourself through another person into conscious partnerships between two people committed to their own growth. The process of withdrawing projections and developing these qualities within yourself is what Jung called individuation, and he considered it the central task of adult psychological development. Individuation doesn't mean becoming selfish or isolated. It means becoming so complete within yourself that you can relate to others from a place of wholeness rather than neediness, choice rather than compulsion, love rather than projection. This understanding completely revolutionizes how we approach romantic relationships. Instead of seeking someone who will complete us, we seek someone who will challenge us to become more completely ourselves. Instead of looking for someone to carry our undeveloped potentials, we attract people who inspire us to develop those potentials within ourselves. Instead of falling in love with our projections, we fall in love with real, flawed, complex human beings who are committed to their own growth and individuation. The journey from projection to conscious love isn't easy, and it certainly isn't quick. It requires the willingness to face painful truths about the gaps between our fantasies and reality. It demands that we take responsibility for our own psychological development rather than expecting others to provide what we lack. It asks us to develop genuine self-love, which Jung believed was prerequisite to loving others authentically. But the rewards of this journey are profound. When you stop falling in love with your own projections, you become available for the kind of deep, authentic intimacy that most people only dream about. You attract partners who are also committed to consciousness and growth. You build relationships based on who you actually are, rather than who you think you should be. You experience the profound joy of being truly known and accepted for your authentic self. Most importantly, you discover that the love you've been seeking outside yourself has been waiting inside you all along. The anima or animus you've been projecting onto others is actually your own inner beloved, the masculine or feminine aspect of your own psyche that you can develop, honor, and integrate. When you marry this inner beloved, when you achieve what Jung called the sacred marriage within yourself, you become capable of the kind of love that doesn't diminish with time or distance, that doesn't depend on another person's behavior or choices, that remains stable through all of life's inevitable changes. This doesn't mean that external relationships become unimportant. Instead, they become expressions of your inner completeness rather than attempts to achieve it. You love others not because you need them to complete you, but because you choose to share your completeness with them. You commit not from fear of being alone, but from genuine appreciation for what you create together. You stay not because you can't survive without them, but because you actively prefer the life you build in partnership. As we near the end of our exploration, I want to leave you with a practice that can help you begin distinguishing between projection and authentic perception in your relationships, both current and future. Jung believed that consciousness was the greatest gift we could give to ourselves and others, and developing the ability to see clearly is one of the most practical applications of consciousness. The next time you find yourself strongly attracted to someone, either romantically or as a friend, take a moment to identify the specific qualities that draw you to them. Write them down if possible. Then ask yourself, to what extent do I embody these qualities in my own life? Where might I be seeing potential rather than present reality? What would it look like for me to develop these attractive qualities within myself? This practice isn't designed to eliminate attraction or make you cynical about relationships. Instead, it's meant to help you approach others with both appreciation and clarity, recognizing the difference between the inspiration someone provides and the projection of your own unlived potential onto their life. When you meet someone who embodies qualities you admire, instead of immediately trying to get closer to them so you can bask in their reflected light, Spend equal energy developing those same qualities within yourself. If you're drawn to their confidence, work on building your own self-assurance. If you're attracted to their creativity, explore your own artistic expression. If you're inspired by their spiritual practice, deepen your own relationship with the sacred. This parallel development serves two profound purposes. First, it ensures that you're relating to others from a place of wholeness rather than neediness. Second, it often makes you genuinely more attractive to the very people who initially triggered your projections, because nothing is more appealing than someone who takes responsibility for their own psychological and spiritual development. Remember, the goal isn't perfection or the complete elimination of projection. Jung himself said that projection is how we first encounter the unconscious parts of ourselves, so it serves an important function in human development. The goal is consciousness, the ability to recognize when you're projecting and to use that recognition as a guide to your own individuation process. Your capacity for authentic love, both of yourself and others, depends entirely on your willingness to face the sometimes uncomfortable truth about the difference between your projections and reality. This facing requires courage, but it's the courage that leads to genuine intimacy, lasting partnership, and the kind of deep satisfaction that comes from being truly known and loved for who you actually are. The path from projection to conscious love is ultimately the path from seeking completion outside yourself to discovering wholeness within yourself. It's the journey from needing others to carry your unlived potential to developing that potential as your gift to the world. It's the transformation from falling in love with fantasies to choosing love with real, imperfect, beautiful human beings who are committed to growing alongside you. This is the love Jung believed was possible for human beings, and it's the love that becomes available when you stop falling in love with your own projections and start falling in love with the magnificent, complex, ever-evolving reality of who you and others actually are. This is the love that heals, that endures, that transforms not just individuals, but the world itself. This is the love that awaits you on the other side of your projections, in the clear, bright territory of conscious relationship.